Right. Let me be upfront with you before we get into this. I am not here to start a war. I am not here to tell you that British developers are some kind of superior species who write flawless code while sipping Earl Grey and quoting Shakespeare. That would be ridiculous. And I have seen enough British code bases held together with prayers and deprecated libraries to know better. What I am here to do is tell you about a conversation that started as a joke in a Slack channel and turned into something that genuinely surprised everyone involved, including me. My name is James. I have been a software developer for 14 years. I started in Manchester, worked in London for a decade, did a stint at a consultancy that sent me to clients across Europe. And for the last 2 years, I have been fully remote, working with an American startup based out of Austin, Texas. Working with an American development team after spending most of your career in British tech is an experience I can only describe as educational. In both directions, there are things the Americans do brilliantly that genuinely made me reconsider my own approach. And there are things I encountered in their code bases that made me sit very quietly for a moment before responding professionally. This is the story of what happened when our team decided to settle a long-running Slack debate properly. UK developers versus USA developers, a structured coding challenge, blind code review, actual metrics, real results. Let us get into it. It started with a comment in our team Slack channel called General, which in most companies is where productivity goes to die. One of the American developers on our team, a senior engineer named Kyle from Denver, posted a link to a survey claiming that American developers were among the most productive in the world, based on lines of code committed per day. Lines of code per day. I stared at that metric for about 30 seconds before I responded. I said, and I want to be measured here. That, lines of code per day, is perhaps the least useful metric ever devised for measuring developer quality. A developer who writes 300 lines of clean, well-tested, properly documented code in a day is doing better work than one who commits 1,000 lines of spaghetti that breaks in production on Thursday. Kyle disagreed. Kyle said output matters. Kyle said, American developers ship faster than anyone in the world, and that speed is what the market rewards. This went on for most of a Tuesday afternoon. By the end, we had a proper argument spanning 47 messages, 3 developers on the UK side, 2 Americans, 1 Canadian who stayed diplomatically neutral, and 1 developer from India who made the most accurate observation of the entire thread, which I will come back to later. The result was a challenge, a formal one. We would each complete the same coding task independently, have the output reviewed blind by 2 senior developers who were not part of the argument, and score the results on a set of agreed criteria. Kyle agreed immediately. I agreed immediately. The Canadian said he would observe. The developer from India said, and I quote, "This is going to be very interesting." He was right. We agreed on the task, the rules, and the scoring criteria over the following week. The task was a back API endpoint. Build a user authentication module with registration, login, token refresh, and logout functionality. Include input validation, error handling, rate limiting, and unit tests. Write documentation for the endpoints. Deploy it to a shared staging environment. Not a beginner task, but not an impossible one either. Any competent mid to senior developer should be able to complete this properly. That was the point. We were not trying to catch anyone out with trick questions or obscure algorithms. We wanted to see how each of us actually built something real. The scoring criteria were agreed in advance by all parties. They covered code readability and naming conventions, error handling completeness, test coverage percentage, documentation quality, performance of the endpoints under load, security considerations, and whether the thing actually worked correctly end to end. Each criterion was scored out of 10. Total possible score was 70 points. The 2 reviewers were both external to our team. One was a British developer with 20 years of experience, who now runs a consultancy in Edinburgh. The other was an American architect based in Seattle with a background in enterprise systems. Neither knew which submission came from which country. We had 1 week to complete the task from the moment it was assigned. No collaboration allowed, no sharing code, no looking at each other's approach until after the review was complete. I sat down on a Sunday evening with a cup of tea, opened my editor, and got to work. My first hour was not writing code. My first hour was planning. I mapped out the full flow on paper. What inputs does each endpoint receive? What validation needs to happen before anything touches the database? What the error responses look like at each failure point? How the token structure works? What the rate-limiting logic needs to track? Where the security considerations sit? Only after I had the full picture on paper did I open my code editor. I wrote the validation layer first. Every endpoint starts with validating what comes in before doing anything else with it. This sounds obvious, but you would be surprised how many code bases I have encountered where validation is an afterthought added at the end or handled inconsistently across different routes. I used clear, descriptive variable names throughout, not abbreviated, not cryptic, not named after what the variable was in my head at the time of writing. Named for what any other developer reading it 6 months later would understand immediately. I wrote tests as I built each function, not at the end. Test-driven development is not the only way to work, but writing tests alongside the code forces you to think about edge cases while you still have the full context in your head, rather than reconstructing it later. The documentation took me about 2 hours. I wrote it as if the person reading it had never seen the codebase before, which is always the correct assumption. By Thursday evening, I was done. 87% test coverage, fully documented, deployed. I spent Friday doing a final review pass and submitted. Kyle's approach was different from mine in almost every way that matters. He started coding immediately. No planning phase. He said he prefers to get something working first and then refactor. That is a legitimate approach. The question is whether the refactoring actually happens. He finished the main functionality by Tuesday. 3 days before I did, his endpoints were working. All 4 functional. He ran it himself, confirmed it worked, and was satisfied. What he did not complete were test documentation and a proper review of the error handling paths. He added tests on Friday, with the explicit goal of hitting a coverage number rather than testing the logic he was actually uncertain about. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. Tests written to cover lines are not the same as tests written to validate behavior. The documentation was brief. Endpoint names, expected inputs, expected outputs. No explanation of error codes. No description of rate-limiting behavior. No notes on security considerations. When I asked him about it, after the results came in, Kyle said he had assumed the documentation would be filled in once the feature was in production and the requirements were fully stable. This is a sentence that made me close my laptop for approximately 45 seconds. To be fair to Kyle, and I want to be fair, his code was fast. The performance benchmarks on his endpoints were excellent. Load his API performed slightly better than mine because he had made some clever caching decisions that I had not implemented. That was genuinely impressive, and I told him so. Here are the final average scores out of 10 for each criterion. Code readability and naming. James 9, Kyle 6, error handling completeness. James 8, Kyle 5, test coverage. James 8, Kyle 5, documentation quality. James 9, Kyle 4, performance under load. James 7, security considerations. James 8, Kyle 6, overall functionality. James 9, Kyle 8, total out of 70. James 58, Kyle 43. Kyle's reaction when he saw the results was not what I expected. He did not argue. He looked at the scores for a long moment and then said, "The documentation score is embarrassing, not defensive, not making excuses." He looked at it honestly and named the thing that hurt most. That response told me more about Kyle as a developer than anything in his codebase. The Edinburgh Reviewer's written notes made a specific observation worth sharing. He wrote that the difference between the two submissions was not intelligence or technical ability. Both developers clearly had strong fundamental skills. The difference was professional discipline. One developer treated the task as shipping a feature. The other treated it as building something that other people would have to live with. The Seattle Reviewer said Kyle's performance optimization was the most creative solution to the caching problem he had seen in a while, and that this instinct was something many senior developers lose. He gave Kyle full marks on performance and said it deserved recognition regardless of the overall result. Both observations were right, and both are worth taking seriously. What this story is actually about is a tension that exists in software development everywhere. The tension between shipping fast and building well, between getting it done and getting it right, between what the business needs now and what the code base needs to survive the next 3 years. American tech culture, particularly in startups, has historically leaned hard towards speed. Move fast, ship now, fix later. This produced companies that grew faster than anyone expected, and also produced technical debt that took years of enormous engineering effort to manage. British and European tech culture has leaned more toward process, documentation, and long-term maintainability. This produces more stable systems that are easier to hand off. It also sometimes produces teams that are slower to ship than the business needs. Neither extreme is correct. The developers who do genuinely excellent work know how to move with urgency, when urgency is real, and build with care when the thing needs to last. They know the difference between a quick prototype and a production system, and they treat each one accordingly. Kyle is a good developer. He knows this about himself, and he is working on it. He asked me to review his next pull request before it went to the team lead. I said, yes, I have my own problems too. My planning phase sometimes runs longer than it needs to. I have shipped features a week late because I was not satisfied with something that was already good enough. That is a real weakness, and I know it. The Canadian developer, who had watched the entire thing in silence, sent one message after the results were posted. It said, "Told you it would be interesting." He was not wrong. Kyle and I now do a fortnightly peer code review, 2 hours every other week, reading each other's actual production code and being honest about what we see. My code has gotten faster, his has gotten more readable. Neither of us is the same developer we were 6 months ago. That is what good technical culture actually looks like. Not a roast, not a scoreboard, just two developers who respect each other enough to tell the truth. The roast was just how we got there. I am James. Thanks for watching. And if your variable is named thing2, please sort that out before I see it.